Hello friend, welcome to Stories by Tocci. We bring you interesting folk tales. Please don't forget to hit the like button, please share, and don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. Thank you for doing so. Now let's get into the story. The soft knock on the kitchen window that morning came with the breeze, subtle and uncertain, like a child too shy to call their mother's name. Amelia didn't flinch. She was seated at the edge of the small dining table, fingers gently wrapped around a ceramic mug that had gone cold long ago. The steam had fled with time, just as warmth had quietly tiptoed out of their marriage, closing the door behind it. Yet here she was, sipping memories like morning tea, reliving conversations that had long stopped making sense. The town of Brayford had not yet stirred awake. Even the birds above the guava tree outside her compound were still negotiating with dawn. But Amelia's mind was miles away, stuck between yesterday's uncertainties and today's expectations. Mark had left at dawn, kissing her cheek so lightly it could have been mistaken for a passing breeze. "Big things loading," he whispered, grinning in that boyish way he used to wear in the early days. She smiled back, the corners of her lips rising like cautious sunflowers afraid of sudden rain. But deep inside, her heart beat a hesitant rhythm, the kind of sound a drum makes when it's cracked, but still trying to hold a song. Her phone buzzed once, then twice, dragging her from her daze. She glanced at the screen, a calendar notification blinking softly. Mark's surprise celebration, 7 p.m., Emerald Halls. No sender. No RSVP request, just a location and time. At first, she assumed it was one of those corporate things, maybe something his office arranged without informing spouses. But the more she stared at it, the more curious it became. It wasn't like Mark to be careless with details. He liked order, precision, lines drawn neatly around every plan. A surprise promotion party made sense. He'd hinted for weeks that his name had been floating around the corridors of top management. He had even shaved twice last week, used cologne on a Sunday, and left his favorite wristwatch behind like a man subtly waiting for someone to notice his change. Amelia had noticed. The way his voice became silkier when he answered calls in the study, how his laugh became fuller but reserved, and how lately even his sighs had rhythm, like they'd been rehearsed. But rather than question what her gut already whispered, she buried the thought under the mountain of hope. After all, she had waited years of scraped savings, night prayers, long silences, and compromise. If this was his moment to shine, she would clap louder than the rest. She rose slowly, the chair beneath her scratching the tiled floor like it too had something to say but didn't know how. Her modest gown swayed gently with her steps as she headed toward the small bedroom, where framed pictures told stories that words no longer could. On the wall, the one from their 3rd anniversary stared back at her, Mark in a sky-blue agbada, one arm loosely over her shoulder, the other holding a wine glass mid-toast. She remembered how he whispered into her ear that night, "Even if the world forgets me, I'll still make you proud." That memory still had wings. It flew straight into her chest and flapped wildly as she dressed. She chose a calm pink blouse with lace patterns around the wrist, paired with a long navy blue skirt that touched her ankles just right. Nothing extravagant, just enough elegance to say, "I'm the woman behind the man." She packed her hair in a simple bun, applied a soft gloss to her lips, and stared at herself for a moment too long. There were creases now where laughter used to live, and a subtle shadow in her eyes that hadn't always been there. But she smiled all the same. Tonight was about him, yes, but also it was about them, about how far they'd come. She grabbed a bottle of red wine, wrapped it in brown paper, slid it into a gift bag, and stepped out, locking the door behind her with a heart too full to see the cracks forming beneath it. The drive to Emerald Halls was quiet, save for the humming engine and the occasional squeak of her old sedan each time it caught a bump. Street lights blurred past like polite strangers nodding without words. As she turned into the venue's crescent, her heart began to gallop, not out of worry, but something softer, anticipation. She imagined how Mark's face would light up when he saw her walk in unexpectedly. She joked that she was the best surprise at his surprise party, and they'd laugh about it on the ride home. Probably stop for suya or ice cream the way they used to when love was new and problems were fewer. At the gate, she rolled down her window and showed the guard the invite on her phone. He glanced, then nodded with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. She thought nothing of it. Inside, the compound was lit like a theater stage, soft white bulbs hanging from wires like fireflies strung in a line, and soft jazz played in the background. She parked carefully, checked her face in the rearview mirror, adjusted her scarf, and stepped out. She parked carefully, checked her face in the rearview mirror, adjusted her scarf, and stepped out. Her heels clicked softly against the cobblestone as she approached the hall. The door stood tall and regal, slightly open as if inviting her in, unaware of what they held behind them. She inhaled deeply, steadied her smile, and walked toward the music, completely unaware that she was about to step into the kind of truth that breaks not just hearts, but time itself. The moment Amelia stepped into the hall, something in the air shifted, not like a storm rolling in with thunder, but more like a breath caught in the throat of time. The room was beautiful in every sense of the word. Chandeliers spilled golden light like melted honey over the polished floor, and round tables dressed in ivory linen sat like guests themselves, waiting patiently for the clink of glasses and careless laughter. The guests, or rather the ones she assumed were Mark's colleagues, were dressed in quiet luxury, the kind that didn't scream but hummed wealth softly between silk blouses and gold cufflinks. Amelia clutched the wine bag tighter and kept walking, her heels echoing faintly against the marble tiles. Her eyes danced across unfamiliar faces, searching for someone, anyone, who might nod in recognition. No one did. It was the way some people looked at her and quickly looked away that first sent a ripple of unease through her spine, like cold fingers tracing the edge of a forgotten secret. She saw a waiter with a tray of flutes gliding past and was about to ask if Mark was around when a sudden hush swept through the room. Heads turned, music lowered. And there, at the far end beneath a rose arch, Mark appeared, smiling, radiant, but not alone. Standing beside him in a gown that glistened like fresh snow was another woman, her hand snug in his, her eyes drenched in joy. At first, Amelia didn't breathe, not because she forgot to, but because her body didn't know what to do with something so impossibly wrong. Her knees buckled slightly, but she caught herself, one hand flying to the pillar beside her as though the building itself might hold her together. She blinked. Once, twice. But the image refused to change. Mark was standing beside this strange woman, the two of them framed perfectly by pastel-colored drapes, a floral canopy, and a priest in a black suit flipping through a Bible. The officiant's voice rang through the mic with a calm certainty. As we gather here to witness the union of these two souls. That was when Amelia's mind stopped spinning and started collapsing, not like a building brought down with explosives, but like an old house surrendering to termites, quietly, from the inside out. Someone brushed past her shoulder, murmuring a soft "excuse me" before taking their seat, and that simple courtesy almost made her laugh. A wild kind of laughter, the kind that doesn't come from joy, but from the realization that the joke has been on you the entire time. Her hands were shaking now. The wine bottle clinked against the gift bag as she slowly turned around, hoping, no, praying for the ground to break open and swallow her whole. But the earth remained cruelly solid beneath her feet, and the walls refused to cave in. So she did the only thing she could. She walked out, each step heavier than the last, like her shoes had filled with cement. The hallway outside the main hall was dimly lit, a long corridor with a velvet carpet and portraits of smiling couples lining the walls, newlyweds frozen in time, promises etched into picture frames. Amelia leaned against one of the walls, heart thudding like a warning drum in a distant village. She felt her chest rising and falling too fast, her throat tight, Her mouth dry, yet her eyes remained dry, a cruel betrayal by the very part of her that should have screamed. She didn't cry. Not yet. Her brain was still trying to make sense of the math. How does a man married to her, who kissed her just that morning, end up exchanging vows with someone else by evening? Was this an elaborate prank? A film shoot? Some twisted company-themed event? But none of those lies could cover the truth she had just seen. Her phone vibrated in her bag, and when she pulled it out, it was Mark's name glowing across the screen like a dare. She didn't answer. Instead, she let it ring until the silence returned, and only then did the tears finally come, quietly at first, slipping down her cheeks like guests sneaking out of a wake. She slid down the wall and hugged her knees to her chest, the wine bag beside her, unopened, forgotten. She felt like a letter returned to sender, unread, unacknowledged, unwanted. She thought of going back inside, of screaming his name until the hall shattered, but her pride, what little remained, wrapped itself around her like a blanket soaked in cold water. She wasn't going to beg for answers in a room where lies wore tuxedos and betrayal smiled for the camera. After what felt like hours, though only minutes had passed, Amelia stood up slowly, wiped her face with the back of her hand, and walked out of the building with a grace that surprised even her. The night air slapped her gently, as if asking, "Are you awake now?" The city of Brayford had no idea what had just happened to her. Traffic lights still blinked, lovers still laughed in parked cars, and the moon still hung above like a blind judge. She got into her car, tossed the wine bag into the passenger seat, and stared at the steering wheel, her fingers trembling over it. For a brief moment, she imagined driving straight to Mark's parents' house and banging on the door, until someone told her it was all a misunderstanding. But another part of her, the part that had always known Mark was changing, whispered a darker truth. He didn't forget her. He simply replaced her. Like a picture frame swapped on a desk or an old coat moved to the back of the closet. The realization sank deep like a hook in water and pulled at everything she thought she knew. So she drove, not toward answers, not toward confrontation, but toward silence. Her home, the one she shared with a man who now belonged to someone else. And as she drove, she kept her eyes on the road, ignoring every memory that tried to cross. Because tonight, even grief had to wait its turn. The key turned in the lock with the resistance that surprised her, like the door had grown weary of opening for a woman who no longer knew where she belonged. Amelia stepped inside the quiet apartment, and immediately the walls leaned in, as if to ask where she had been. The overhead bulb flickered once before holding steady, casting a pale glow over the living room that felt far too familiar for the kind of change her heart had just encountered. She dropped her bag on the floor, not carelessly, but with the kind of heaviness that comes when you're too tired to be gentle. The wine bottle tipped and rolled to the edge of the carpet, stopping inches away from the coffee table like it too was deciding whether to shatter. Her scarf was still pinned in place, but her soul had unraveled somewhere between the venue gate and the traffic light she'd waited under for longer than necessary. She stared at the couch where Mark usually sat to take his calls, often pretending to turn down the volume on the TV while actually muting her presence. The silence in the house now roared louder than thunder, and it pressed against her ears like a secret begging to be said aloud. She moved toward the window and parted the curtains, not to admire the night, but to confirm that the world still moved, that buses still honked, that streetlights still blinked, that life hadn't paused just because hers had. She wandered into the bedroom like a ghost who had forgotten how to float, and the familiar scent of Mark's aftershave still lingered in the folds of the duvet. Her eyes landed on the small drawer beside their bed, the one he always kept locked. A drawer she had never tried to open, because love, to her, was not a courtroom affair. It wasn't something she needed evidence to defend. But tonight, something inside her cracked just enough for courage to slip through. She grabbed a thin hairpin from her vanity table and knelt by the drawer. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the quiet betrayal that came with doing something she'd sworn she never would. The lock gave way after a few tries, and the drawer opened with a reluctant sigh, like even it felt ashamed of what it held. Inside were scattered receipts, a few envelopes, 2 foreign SIM cards, and a passport-sized photo of the woman in the white gown, smiling the kind of smile that hadn't visited Amelia in years. Tucked beneath the folder was a printed wedding program, the one from the ceremony she hadn't known she wasn't invited to. Her own husband's name was printed boldly beside the woman's, along with a date that confirmed everything had been in motion long before tonight. The more she flipped through the drawer's contents, the more her heart became a sieve, unable to hold the pieces of love that kept falling through. She didn't cry this time. Not even a drop. She placed everything back, locked the drawer again, and sat on the edge of the bed, unsure of whether to scream or sleep. Her phone buzzed beside her. It was Tricia. She hesitated, then answered, forcing her voice to steady. Tricia was already mid-sentence when Amelia pressed the phone to her ear. "I saw something on Facebook," her friend whispered, her voice tight, like she was speaking with her teeth clenched. "Amelia, did you know Mark got married?" The words were strange on someone else's tongue, like hearing your own story from a stranger's lips. Amelia nodded, though no one could see her. "I saw it," she said, her tone flat, like a page with no ink. Tricia went silent for a moment. "What happened?" she asked gently, as if touching a wound that still bled. Amelia sighed. "I walked in thinking it was a promotion party," she said. "Turns out I was the only one who didn't know he was the groom." Tricia gasped audibly, followed by silence so thick it could be sliced with a blade. Then came the questions. Did you confront him? Did anyone stop you? Did he see you? Amelia answered none of them. Her heart wasn't ready to relive what it hadn't yet digested. "I just want to sleep," she murmured, ending the call. She placed the phone face down, turned off the bedside lamp, and lay there in the dark, wide-eyed, as if the ceiling might someday spell out a reason. Morning didn't arrive. It crept. The sky outside turned from black to gray, as though even the sun was uncertain about showing up. Amelia sat by the window, fully dressed but unsure where to go. She had no appetite, no errands, no appointments. Just questions. Her eyes scanned the empty room, pausing at the mirror. She walked toward it and stared long and hard. "You let him," she whispered to her reflection. "You saw him changing. You chose silence." The woman in the mirror didn't argue. She just stared back, worn but not broken. A knock came at the door, soft, hesitant. She opened it to find a delivery man holding a bouquet of roses. "For Mrs. Amelia Barker," he said. "Her name. Her married name." A note was tucked between the petals. "I never wanted to hurt you. Please let's talk. Mark." She took the flowers, not out of hope, but out of habit. As she shut the door, she dropped them in the kitchen sink and turned on the tap. The water ran, soaking the petals until the red bled into the drain like something guilty being washed away. She didn't need his apology wrapped in petals. What she needed was to remember who she was before her love became a room he stepped out of with someone else. The silence in the house had started to take shape, thickening with each passing hour until it pressed against the walls like smoke with nowhere to go. Amelia began to notice things she'd ignored for years. The faint scratch on the kitchen tile from where Mark once dropped a heavy pot, the dent in the doorframe he promised to fix, the framed photo above the dining table now slightly crooked like the truth it silently carried. Each object around her felt like a witness, and every corner of the house whispered stories she had tried to forget. She moved slowly, deliberately, as though time had lost its urgency. When she reached for a spoon, her mind wandered back to the evening he first taught her how to make okra soup, laughing with flour on his cheek, dancing in socks on the wet kitchen floor. How could someone who knew her favorite stew, the spot behind her ear that tickled, and how she liked her pillowcases ironed, become a stranger wearing a wedding band that didn't include her? It was a thought too heavy to carry for long, so she abandoned it like a hot coal dropped without shame. Outside, the rain tapped gently on the roof, not fierce, not angry, just persistent, like grief asking for attention. She drew the curtains halfway, not to keep the world out, but to leave just enough space for light to remind her it still existed. Days passed like fog, heavy, shapeless, and barely counted. Amelia didn't tell anyone at school what happened. She simply called in sick and stayed tucked beneath her duvet like a child hiding from monsters, except hers wore perfume and signed wedding registers. On the third morning, Tricia returned, this time with groceries and a face full of questions she knew better than to ask. She sat beside Amelia on the floor of the living room, where they sipped hot tea and spoke in incomplete sentences. Do you want to? No. Should we? Not yet. Tricia respected silence the way some people respect sacred ground, but even sacred places eventually get swept. Amelia, she said softly, you have to come up for air. You're not the one who did wrong. Amelia looked at her, eyes dull but steady. Then why does it feel like I'm the one who failed? Tricia didn't answer immediately. She took a slow sip of tea and stared at the wall before whispering, because you built something with your bare hands and watched it burn. It's hard not to blame yourself when the ashes are in your own lap. Amelia blinked, tears threatening but refusing to fall. She didn't want to be pitied. She wanted to be understood, and in that moment she was. They sat in silence for another hour. Then Tricia rose and quietly cleaned the dishes, her presence as comforting as a warm quilt on a bitter night. For the first time in days, Amelia slept without clutching her phone like a lifeline. It wasn't until a full week had passed that Amelia decided to leave the house, not because she had healed, but because the walls had started to close in. She didn't dress fancy, just a plain dress, her hair tied back, no earrings, no perfume. She walked to the public library and sat in the farthest corner, not to read but to breathe. The room smelled like old pages and floor polish, oddly soothing, like a memory that didn't hurt. She watched people come and go, students scribbling notes, retirees dozing off with newspapers on their laps, children chasing echoes in the hallway. Life had the audacity to go on, and for the first time, she didn't resent it. She picked up a novel and flipped through its pages absent-mindedly until she found a quote underlined in pencil. Not all storms come to disrupt your life. Some come to clear your path. She stared at the line for several seconds before closing the book and holding it against her chest. It didn't feel like healing, not yet, but it felt like a nudge. As she left the library, the afternoon sun peeked shyly from behind the clouds, casting warm patches on the pavement. A little boy pointed at her scarf and smiled. My mummy has one like that, he said. Amelia smiled back, the gesture stiff but genuine, like someone learning how to use their hands again after an accident. When she returned home that evening, she noticed an envelope tucked into her gate. Her name was written on it in Mark's handwriting, and inside was a letter that read like a confession and an excuse at once. He wrote of pressure, of not wanting to disappoint the version of himself that people expected. He wrote about feeling trapped, about how Vanessa made him feel visible again, and how he had tried to end things with Amelia but couldn't find the right time. Each sentence was a needle, and by the end, she wasn't bleeding. She was numb. He ended the letter with a plea. Please let me explain everything, not to win you back, but to let you heal properly. Amelia folded the letter slowly, as if careful not to disturb its lies, then slid it back into the envelope and placed it on the center table. She didn't tear it. She didn't curse it. She simply chose not to carry it. That night, she prepared rice and stew for herself and ate in silence. No TV, no music, just the clink of her spoon against the ceramic plate. After dinner, she swept the house thoroughly, not just the visible corners, but beneath beds, behind shelves, and even the cobwebs near the ceiling. It was the kind of cleaning you do when you're trying to start over without saying so. And when she finally sat on the floor, sweaty and tired, she whispered to herself, let it be enough, just for tonight. It was a soft promise, not to forget, but to begin. The weeks that followed didn't offer answers, only space. Space wide enough for questions to echo louder than reason. Amelia moved through her days like someone walking barefoot on broken glass, careful not to bleed too much, but still pierced at every step. She resumed work at the school with a smile that had more stitches than substance. The children didn't notice, not really, but adults did. Her colleagues greeted her with gentler eyes, as though the news had traveled on quiet tongues. She ignored the murmurs. She kept her lessons sharp and her attendance perfect, finding comfort in routine, even if it felt like she was operating a version of herself on autopilot. Every morning she packed her lunch, watered the flower pots at the school gate, and marked books with red ink, pretending the red didn't remind her of things she'd rather forget. The lipstick shade on Mark's new bride, the roses that bled in her kitchen sink, the shame that spread through her like wildfire under her calm. She wasn't angry anymore, not in the way people expected. The fire had burned fast and deep, but what remained now was ash, quiet, gray, and clinging to everything she touched. Then one Sunday afternoon, while sitting under the mango tree at her compound with her Bible open but unread, a voice called her name. She looked up and saw Mrs. Egan, Mark's mother, standing at the gate with her handbag pressed tight against her side like a shield. Amelia stood slowly, uncertain whether to be gracious or guarded. The last meeting had been months ago, back when she and Mark were still attending family dinners and pretending love didn't limp. "Can I come in?" the older woman asked, voice trembling slightly like a curtain caught between two winds. Amelia nodded without speaking and moved aside to let her through. They sat under the tree in silence at first, the air thick with things neither of them had rehearsed. Finally, Mrs. Egan reached into her bag and brought out a folded letter. "He lied to all of us," she said, her voice breaking like old wood. "He told me you both had agreed to separate, that he waited. I believed him." Amelia said nothing. There was nothing left to defend. The letter, as it turned out, wasn't from Mark. It was from Mrs. Egan herself, a note filled with sorrow and something that felt close to shame. She apologized not just for her son, but for the silence she had maintained after hearing rumors. She had seen the photos online, read the comments, watched the smiles of a wedding she hadn't attended. "I wanted to call," she said, "but I didn't know what to say to a woman abandoned in such a manner." Amelia finally spoke. "There's nothing left to say. I just want peace." And in that moment, peace looked like two women sharing a bench under a tree, not as mother and daughter-in-law, but as women who knew what it meant to be broken quietly. Later that evening, after her unexpected visitor left, Amelia sat in the living room and stared at the ceiling, watching a lizard crawl slowly along the edge. The creature seemed sure of where it was going, unlike her. She picked up her phone for the first time in days and opened her email, intending to clear junk messages. That was when she noticed one particular thread, an old conversation between her and Mark during their first year of marriage. They had planned a trip back then, a weekend getaway to celebrate their anniversary in Alleran Beach Resort, a place they'd never gotten to visit. He had saved a screenshot of their booking details in the thread. It was still there, unread, like a memory sealed in a bottle. Amelia opened the attachment and stared at it for several seconds before an idea quietly crept in. She didn't want to run away from Brayford, but maybe she needed to step outside it long enough to see her life from a distance. She booked a small chalet at Alleran, not as a romantic escape, but as a retreat for clarity. She didn't pack anything fancy, just a few clothes, her Bible, a notebook, and a pair of sandals. When she arrived 3 days later, the ocean breeze greeted her like a long-lost friend, and the sound of waves crashing against rocks reminded her of how survival often comes in tides, sometimes pulling you under, other times pushing you forward. She sat by the shore that evening, notebook on her lap, and began to write not a letter to Mark, but a letter to herself, to the woman who once believed too much, waited too long, and still found the strength to remain soft without breaking. By the second night at Oleron, Amelia had written 5 full pages, not of poetry or revenge or longing, but of memories arranged like puzzle pieces she was no longer trying to force together. She wrote about the first time Mark called her home, the way he used to listen with his eyes, and the slow, silent erosion of intimacy that followed his promotions and late-night strategy meetings. She didn't demonize him, but she didn't protect him either. She called things what they were: betrayal, cowardice, abandonment. Writing gave her back her voice, not the loud kind, but the steady kind that fills a room even when unspoken. On her final morning there, she folded the letter and slipped it into her journal, not to send but to keep a record of how far she'd come. When she returned to Brayford, something had shifted. The house no longer felt like a museum of pain, but a place waiting to be rewritten. She boxed up Mark's belongings and placed them outside the front door, not with spite, but with finality. She left him a short message: "Pick up what's yours. I've already collected what's mine. Peace." Then she sat at the edge of her bed, listening to the birds outside, as if hearing them for the first time. Her wounds were still fresh, but they were no longer open. And in that quiet victory, Amelia began to breathe like someone no longer holding their breath for love. The sun rose that Saturday with no urgency, casting a golden curtain across Amelia's wall like an artist unsure whether to finish the painting. She had woken up before dawn, not because she had somewhere pressing to be, but because the quiet inside her chest had matured into something weightier. Not sorrow, not anger, but something akin to resolve. She bathed slowly, ran a comb through her hair with care, and reached for the blue gown she hadn't worn in nearly a year. It was the same gown she had bought for their 5th anniversary dinner, a dinner Mark had postponed twice and eventually replaced with a work call that ran into midnight. Today, she wore it not to impress anyone, but to remind herself that she had always been enough, more than enough, even when unseen. The streets of Brayford welcomed her footsteps like an old song one hasn't heard in years, familiar but distant. She passed by the community center, the fruit stall where she used to buy pawpaw with Mark on Sundays, and the bus stop where he'd once held her hand so tightly it felt like a vow. Now, the world moved around her while those memories sat quietly, no longer aching like thorns, but resting like leaves that had finally fallen from a branch that could no longer carry them. She arrived at the family law firm by midday, papers in hand, heart steady, eyes clear. The receptionist recognized her name and led her in. A few signatures, some document exchanges, and then silence. Amelia stood up, shook the lawyer's hand, and whispered the words that sealed it all. "Thank you. That'll be all." And with that, the marriage that had once held her like a promise folded itself into paper and was done. She returned home to find Mark waiting in front of the gate, his car parked slightly off-center like his conscience. He was dressed neatly, as always, crisp shirt, polished shoes, the kind of man who knew how to package ruin with a clean collar. He stood as she approached, hands in his pockets, unsure whether to speak or stay still. "You didn't have to come," she said, keys already in hand. He sighed, his voice softer than she remembered. "I just needed to see you, one last time." She looked at him, and for a fleeting moment, she saw the man he once was, the one who danced with her in the rain, who once cried when her father died, who whispered her name like a lullaby when she couldn't sleep. But that man was buried beneath too many layers of betrayal, too many apologies written after the wound had already scarred. "I won't beg," he continued. "You've always been the best part of my life. I was just too stupid to see it." Amelia nodded, the wind tugging gently at her scarf like it wanted her to walk away. "You were stupid," she said, "but not blind. You saw what I gave, and you left anyway. That's not blindness, that's choice." He lowered his eyes, silence growing thick between them. She opened the gate, then paused. "Take your things. They're in the corridor." He looked at her one last time, perhaps hoping for something, a hug, a tear, an opening. But she gave him only the truth, the quiet dignity of a woman who had made peace with her past. and that, she knew, would haunt him longer than any insult could. Weeks passed, and each day arrived with a softness Amelia hadn't felt in years. She returned to the library on weekends, this time not to escape, but to linger. She joined a small writers' group that met every Thursday, where people shared stories that carried bruises but also breath. One evening, during a reading session, she shared a piece, not fiction, not quite a diary, just lines scribbled in the space between memory and meaning. When she finished, the room was quiet. One of the women, a retired nurse named Evelyn, touched her arm and whispered, "You should write a book." The idea settled in her mind like a seed waiting for rain. She began writing at night, long after the world went to sleep, telling her story not with bitterness, but with balance. Each word became a brick, and slowly she built something out of the ruins, not a monument to pain, but a testament to what survived it. Her manuscript, What I Walked Into, took 6 months to complete. When she held the first printed copy in her hands, she didn't cry. She smiled, the kind of smile that comes when the wound no longer speaks louder than the wisdom it birthed. Life didn't return to what it once was. It became something better, something honest, something earned. One bright afternoon, nearly a year after the wedding that was never hers, Amelia sat at the town's open book fair, with a table set up beneath a large white umbrella. Her book rested in neat stacks, and a soft breeze carried pages like whispers. People stopped by, flipping through chapters, some recognizing her from her old days at the school, others drawn by the title alone. She spoke to them with ease, not as someone who had suffered, but as someone who had come out the other side holding light. A young woman, perhaps in her early 20s, approached her nervously. "Are you the author?" she asked, voice barely audible. Amelia nodded. The girl bit her lip, then said, "I almost married someone last month who reminded me of your ex. Your story saved me." Amelia blinked, her throat tightening, but she reached for the girl's hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. "Then maybe it was worth it," she whispered. As the fair carried on, she noticed a familiar face in the crowd, the widowed photographer from the library. He raised a hand in greeting, then pointed to a camera strapped around his neck. "Mind if I capture the woman who turned ashes into paper?" he asked playfully. She laughed, not the brittle sound of before, but something full and open. "Only if you catch my good side," she teased. And as he snapped the photo, the lens froze not just a moment, but a message. Sometimes life breaks us not to end us, but to begin us again, clearer, lighter, and unafraid of our own reflection. Not every storm comes with thunder. Some arrive in quiet betrayals, a conversation withheld, a truth buried, a vow broken without notice. Amelia's story is not just about heartbreak, it's about rediscovery. It reminds us that being blindsided by someone you love doesn't mean you were foolish. It means you trusted, and trust is never a weakness. It's a mirror of your strength, your honesty, your capacity to love without borders. If you've ever found yourself walking into something you weren't prepared for, whether it's betrayal, rejection, or sudden loss, know this: you are not what they did to you. You are what you do with it. You are not defined by the person who left without explanation or the one who gave your place to someone else. Your identity is not tied to their decision to devalue what you brought to the table. If they didn't see your worth, it doesn't mean it wasn't there. It means their eyes were too small to hold the truth. Let the story remind you to return to yourself. Return to your peace. Rebuild your confidence. If your heart was broken in private, let your healing be a quiet, daily revolution. The softest revenge is choosing not to crumble. The loudest victory is finding joy again without needing an apology. Sometimes God allows the wrong doors to slam shut. You don't waste your whole life knocking. What looked like rejection may have been your redirection. So when peace starts knocking, open wide. Dear Lord, to every listener still nursing wounds they never saw coming, I lift them before you. Father, you see the hearts that broke behind closed doors, the silent tears cried into pillows, the long nights spent questioning worth. You see it all, and you never turn away. Lord, give them the grace to stand again, not in bitterness, but in boldness. Remind them that they were never the mistake. They were the blessing that was mishandled. Heal the parts of them that still flinch at certain names, certain dates, certain memories. And for every listener who is carrying shame that doesn't belong to them, strip it away and replace it with truth. May they find strength to close chapters with dignity, to walk away from dishonor without dragging themselves through guilt. May peace become their home again. May joy sneak up on them like a surprise, not because life became perfect, but because they stopped tying their healing to someone else's apology. Father, restore what was stolen in the silence. Rebuild what crumbled when no one was watching. Remind them that nothing broken is beyond repair when placed in your hands. And Lord, when they finally smile again, let it be wide, let it be honest, and let it last. In Jesus' name we pray, amen. Hope you enjoyed this interesting story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel. See you again in my next story.